The security guard at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado barely lifted his eyes from his morning coffee when the elderly woman approached the main gate at dawn on what would become the most remarkable day in military training history. Margaret Sullivan's silver hair was neatly braided beneath a simple baseball cap, and her comfortable walking shoes suggested someone planning a leisurely stroll rather than attempting the most grueling physical challenge in the United States military. The morning California mist rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, carrying the salt scent that had awakened countless warriors throughout the decades, though none quite like the unassuming grandmother who now stood patiently waiting for clearance to enter what many considered the most exclusive training facility on Earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony was breathtaking in its simplicity. Here stood a woman whose appearance suggested fragility and limitation, requesting access to a program specifically designed to break the strongest men alive. Navy SEAL training had earned its legendary status through systematic elimination of candidates who possessed every physical advantage that Margaret seemingly lacked. Young athletes collapsed under the relentless pressure. Elite soldiers discovered their limits and surrendered their dreams. Former college football players found themselves sobbing in the surf as instructors explained that mental toughness couldn't be taught to those who weren't born with it. Yet this grandmother, who might struggle to lift her own luggage, claimed she belonged among warriors whose very existence defied human limitations. What made the moment even more surreal was the complete absence of fanfare or recognition surrounding her arrival. No media crews documented this historic attempt. No military officials prepared special accommodations for the unprecedented situation. Margaret had somehow navigated the complex bureaucratic maze that typically prevented civilians from accessing classified training programs. Yet her presence triggered no special protocols or heightened security measures. She stood in line behind routine visitors as if attempting Navy SEAL training at age 80 was the most natural thing in the world, her calm demeanor suggesting someone entirely comfortable with decisions that others might consider impossible. The morning briefing that had taken place just hours earlier in the commander's office revealed the institutional skepticism that surrounded Margaret's unexpected arrival. Senior officers had debated whether allowing her to attempt even the preliminary physical assessments represented dangerous liability or simply harmless accommodation for someone whose delusions would be quickly corrected by reality. The consensus had been that medical evaluations would eliminate her from consideration long before she could endanger herself or waste valuable training resources on what everyone assumed was either elaborate publicity stunt or serious mental health episode. Dr. Emily Watson had reviewed Margaret's submitted medical records with the professional thoroughness that military medicine demanded, though she privately questioned how an octogenarian had even obtained the preliminary clearances necessary to reach this stage of evaluation. The documentation appeared legitimate, showing routine health maintenance for someone of advanced age, but nothing that suggested capability for physical activities that challenged elite athletes in their prime. Bone density scans revealed the expected deterioration of advanced age. Cardiovascular assessments showed typical decline associated with decades of life. Muscle mass measurements fell well below minimum standards established for candidates half her age and twice her apparent fitness level. Yet something in the paperwork nagged at Dr. Watson's professional instincts, though she couldn't identify exactly what seemed inconsistent about the medical profile. The records were complete and properly formatted, bearing appropriate signatures and certification stamps from recognized medical facilities. Blood work showed normal ranges for someone Margaret's age. X-rays revealed typical wear patterns associated with 8 decades of life. Everything appeared routine and unremarkable, which somehow made the entire situation feel even more unusual than if the records had shown obvious anomalies or concerning health issues. The walking path that led Margaret from the security checkpoint to the administrative processing center took her past training areas where current SEAL candidates were already engaged in their morning physical conditioning. The contrast was stark and unmistakable as young men in peak physical condition executed demanding exercises under the watchful supervision of instructors whose reputation for creating warriors was matched only by their skill at eliminating those who lacked the necessary qualities. Push-ups, pull-ups, and running drills were performed with precision that reflected months of preparation and natural athletic ability that Margaret obviously couldn't possess. What the observing candidates couldn't know was that Margaret's unhurried pace along the pathway reflected careful observation rather than physical limitation. Her eyes catalogued training techniques and assessed instructor methods with the analytical focus of someone whose understanding of military conditioning exceeded what casual observation might suggest. The exercises being performed were familiar to her, though the specific protocols had evolved since her own experience with similar training decades earlier. Modern equipment and updated safety procedures reflected in preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Improvements in training science, but the fundamental challenges remained unchanged from the programs that had shaped her own understanding of human potential. Building 47 housed the administrative machinery that processed the endless stream of hopefuls who believed they possessed the qualities necessary for SEAL qualification. The waiting area was filled with young men whose physical appearance suggested serious dedication to fitness and conditioning. Broad shoulders and muscular builds marked candidates who had spent years preparing for this opportunity. Confident postures and athletic bearing indicated individuals accustomed to physical success and competitive achievement. Conversation topics revealed extensive research into training requirements and careful preparation for challenges that awaited those selected for actual instruction. Margaret took a seat among these physical specimens with the quiet composure of someone entirely comfortable with situations that might intimidate others. Her presence triggered curious glances and barely concealed amusement from candidates who struggled to understand why an elderly woman was occupying space in a facility dedicated to creating the world's most elite warriors. Some assumed she was waiting for a relative or perhaps had become confused about her intended destination. Others speculated that she might be conducting research or gathering information for some civilian purpose unrelated to actual training participation. The processing clerk who called Margaret's name displayed the professional courtesy that military personnel extended to all visitors, though her expression suggested someone struggling to reconcile bureaucratic requirements with obvious reality. The paperwork indicated that Margaret Sullivan was scheduled for preliminary physical assessment and orientation briefing as a potential SEAL training candidate. The absurdity was so complete that the clerk double-checked her computer system to ensure that administrative error hadn't created impossible situation requiring correction and explanation to superior officers. Staff Sergeant Kevin Brooks had processed thousands of SEAL candidates during his career in training coordination, but Margaret's file represented something entirely outside his experience. The preliminary application materials were properly completed and appropriately submitted through official channels. Background checks had been conducted according to standard procedures. Security clearances were current and properly documented. Medical records were complete and submitted in required format. Everything appeared routine except for the obvious fact that the applicant was an 80-year-old grandmother whose physical appearance suggested she would struggle with basic military conditioning requirements. The initial interview that Brooks conducted with Margaret followed standard protocols designed to assess candidate motivation and understanding of training requirements. His questions explored her reasons for seeking SEAL training and her comprehension of physical demands that eliminated the majority of applicants regardless of their preparation or natural ability. Margaret's responses demonstrated surprising familiarity with military culture and training philosophy, though Brooks attributed this to research rather than actual experience. Her calm confidence in the face of obvious physical limitations suggested either remarkable self-delusion or mental health issues that medical evaluation would hopefully identify and address. What Brooks couldn't detect during his routine assessment was the careful way Margaret answered his questions with complete honesty while revealing nothing that might trigger deeper investigation of her background. She acknowledged her age and understood the physical demands of SEAL training. She expressed genuine desire to participate in the program and accepted responsibility for any consequences that might result from her attempt. Her responses satisfied bureaucratic requirements while providing no insight into the experiences that had actually prepared her for challenges that Brooks couldn't imagine she could survive. The medical evaluation that followed represented the first serious obstacle that Margaret would face in her unlikely journey toward SEAL qualification. Dr. Emily Watson approached the assessment with professional thoroughness tempered by genuine concern for someone whose safety might be endangered by delusional beliefs about her own capabilities. The examination protocols were designed to identify physical limitations that might prevent safe participation in training activities that regularly injured candidates in peak condition. Blood pressure, heart rate, joint mobility, and muscle strength were measured against standards that eliminated candidates who possessed every advantage that Margaret obviously lacked. The results of Margaret's physical examination created the first crack in the assumption that her attempt at SEAL training represented harmless delusion that would be quickly corrected by reality. Her blood pressure readings fell within acceptable ranges for someone half her age. Heart rate and recovery measurements suggested cardiovascular conditioning that exceeded expectations for her demographic. Joint mobility assessments revealed flexibility and range of motion that challenged assumptions about age-related physical decline. Most surprising, strength measurements indicated muscle development that couldn't be explained by typical fitness activities available to civilian retirees. Dr. Watson found herself reviewing the test results multiple times to ensure that measurement errors hadn't created false impressions about Margaret's actual physical condition. The numbers were consistent and properly documented, but they suggested capabilities that seemed impossible for someone of Margaret's age and apparent background. Bone density scans showed readings that belonged to someone decades younger. Muscle mass measurements fell within ranges typically associated with serious athletes. Cardiovascular efficiency indicators suggested training regimens that required knowledge and discipline beyond what casual fitness activities could provide. The preliminary obstacle course assessment that concluded Margaret's first day of evaluation provided the most dramatic evidence that initial assumptions about her capabilities might require serious revision. The course was designed as an introductory challenge that familiarized candidates with equipment and techniques they would encounter during actual training. Rope climbing, wall scaling, and equipment carrying were performed at moderate intensity to assess basic coordination and strength levels. Most candidates struggled with elements that would become routine during advanced training phases, providing instructors with baseline measurements for individual development planning. Margaret approached the obstacle course with methodical precision that suggested familiarity with similar challenges rather than first-time nervousness that characterized most candidates. Her movements were economical and efficient, displaying technique refinements that typically required extensive practice to develop. Rope climbing was accomplished with hand-over-hand methods that minimized energy expenditure while maintaining steady progress. Wall scaling utilized momentum and leverage principles that demonstrated understanding of physics applications in physical challenges. Equipment carrying was performed with load distribution techniques that prevented fatigue and injury during extended efforts. The time that Margaret recorded for obstacle course completion was respectable for any candidate regardless of age or experience level. More importantly, her performance demonstrated technical proficiency that suggested previous exposure to similar training challenges. Instructors who observed her attempt found themselves questioning their assumptions about age-related limitations and civilian preparation possibilities. The smooth execution of complex movements indicated muscle memory that couldn't be explained by typical recreational activities available to retirees seeking adventure or personal challenge. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rick Daniels had supervised thousands of obstacle course assessments during his career in SEAL instruction, but Margaret's performance represented something unprecedented in his experience. The technical elements she demonstrated weren't taught in civilian fitness programs or recreational climbing activities. Her rope climbing technique specifically reflected military training protocols that weren't available through public instruction. Wall scaling methods showed familiarity with tactical approaches that required specialized knowledge and extensive practice to perfect. Equipment handling revealed understanding of weight distribution principles that prevented injury during extended physical effort. The evening briefing that Daniels conducted with other instructors focused on the unprecedented situation that Margaret's unexpected competence had created. Routine elimination of unqualified candidates was straightforward when physical limitations were obvious and easily documented. Age-related decline provided clear justification for preventing dangerous participation in activities that could result in serious injury or death. But Margaret's preliminary assessments suggested capabilities that challenged institutional assumptions about appropriate candidates for SEAL training programs. Commander Jake Morrison found himself facing administrative and legal complexities that had no precedent in military training protocols. Equal opportunity regulations prevented discrimination based on age when candidates met established physical and mental standards. Margaret's preliminary evaluations suggested she might actually qualify for advancement to more challenging assessment phases, creating unprecedented situation that could attract unwanted attention from media and political interests. The decision to allow her continued participation required careful consideration of liability issues balanced against regulatory compliance and institutional reputation. The conversations that took place throughout the base that evening reflected widespread confusion about appropriate responses to Margaret's unexpected presence. Candidates who had observed her obstacle course performance struggled to reconcile her obvious age with demonstrated capabilities that exceeded many younger applicants. Instructors debated whether her technical proficiency resulted from exceptional natural ability or previous training that she hadn't disclosed during preliminary interviews. Medical personnel reviewed test results multiple times, seeking explanations for physical measurements that challenged their understanding of age-related decline. What none of these discussions could address was the fundamental question of Margaret's actual background and the experiences that had prepared her for challenges that destroyed candidates who possessed every apparent physical advantage. Her calm confidence throughout preliminary assessments suggested someone entirely comfortable with military training environments and physical demands that intimidated elite athletes. The technical proficiency she demonstrated indicated previous exposure to instruction that wasn't available through civilian programs or recreational activities. The morning of Margaret's second day at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado dawned clear and cold, with Pacific winds carrying the promise of challenging conditions that would test every candidate's resolve and preparation. She arrived at the designated assembly area with the same quiet punctuality that had marked her first day, though now her presence triggered more serious attention from instructors who had spent the previous evening reviewing her unexpected performance results. The other candidates gathered around her with curious respect, their initial amusement replaced by genuine interest in understanding how someone of her age had successfully completed preliminary assessments that eliminated younger and apparently stronger applicants. The morning briefing that Commander Morrison conducted included explicit acknowledgement of Margaret's presence and the unprecedented nature of her participation in SEAL candidate evaluation. His words were carefully chosen to address potential concerns about special treatment or modified standards, while emphasizing that all candidates would be held to identical requirements regardless of age, background, or personal circumstances. The message was clear that Margaret's continued presence meant she had earned her position through demonstrated competence rather than administrative accommodation or publicity considerations. Staff Sergeant Brooks approached Margaret before the day's training activities commenced, carrying questions that had kept him awake throughout the previous night, reviewing her preliminary assessment results. Her obstacle course performance had demonstrated technical proficiency that suggested previous military training, though her background check had revealed no indication of service experience or specialized instruction. The precision of her movements and efficiency of her techniques indicated familiarity with protocols that weren't taught in civilian programs, creating puzzles that demanded explanation before training could continue. Margaret's response to Brooks's inquiries was characteristically direct and completely uninformative, acknowledging his concerns while providing no additional insight into her background or preparation methods. She confirmed that she had never served in any branch of the military and had no formal training in tactical techniques or specialized physical conditioning. Her previous experience was limited to routine civilian activities and recreational fitness programs available to any retiree seeking to maintain health and mobility during advanced age. The explanation was plausible and properly documented, but it failed to address the obvious contradictions between her claimed background and demonstrated capabilities. The advanced physical assessment that began Margaret's second day represented a significant escalation in difficulty and intensity compared to preliminary evaluations. Swimming requirements included distance and endurance challenges that eliminated candidates who lacked exceptional cardiovascular conditioning and technical proficiency in multiple stroke techniques. Ocean swimming introduced variables of temperature, current, and wave action that transformed routine exercise into survival skills requiring courage and competence that couldn't be faked or approximated through casual preparation. Margaret entered the Pacific Ocean with other candidates at dawn when water temperature and wave conditions created maximum challenge for swimming assessments that would determine advancement to more intensive training phases. The distance requirements were substantial enough to eliminate anyone whose preparation had been inadequate or whose natural ability fell below minimum standards. Ocean conditions added complexity that transformed swimming from athletic activity into tactical skill requiring navigation, endurance, and environmental awareness that exceeded typical civilian experience. The performance that Margaret delivered during ocean swimming assessments silenced every doubt about her physical capabilities and raised new questions about the background that had prepared her for challenges that destroyed elite athletes. Her stroke technique was flawless and efficient, demonstrating refinements that required years of practice under expert instruction. Navigation skills allowed her to maintain course accuracy despite current and wave action that confused other candidates. Most impressive was her apparent comfort in conditions that triggered panic responses in younger swimmers whose preparation had focused on pool training rather than open water experience. Exceptional levels. The course included varied terrain that tested different muscle groups and movement patterns, while maintaining pace requirements that challenged even naturally gifted runners. Beach sand, rocky trails, and paved surfaces created constantly changing demands that required adaptation and technique modification throughout the assessment period. Margaret's approach to the running assessment demonstrated the same methodical efficiency that had characterized her swimming performance, though now her technique revealed familiarity with distance running strategies that required extensive experience to develop. Her pace was steady and sustainable, showing understanding of energy management principles that prevented early exhaustion while maintaining speed requirements throughout the assessment distance. Stride length and frequency were optimized for efficiency rather than speed, demonstrating training philosophy that prioritized completion over competitive positioning. The terrain changes that challenged other candidates seemed to present no difficulty for Margaret, whose movement patterns adapted seamlessly to surface variations that required different running techniques. Beach sand running utilized shortened stride and increased frequency that maintained momentum while preventing sinking that slowed other candidates. Trail running showed familiarity with uneven surfaces and obstacle navigation that suggested extensive off-road experience. Paved surface running returned to longer stride patterns that maximized efficiency on stable ground. Senior Chief Daniels monitored Margaret's running performance from various observation points along the course, his experienced eye cataloging technique elements that revealed training background far beyond what civilian fitness programs could provide. Her hill climbing technique specifically demonstrated knowledge of biomechanical principles that weren't taught in recreational running programs. Descent control showed understanding of injury prevention methods that required instruction from coaches familiar with trail running at competitive levels. Most telling was her apparent comfort with sustained physical effort at intensity levels that challenged candidates whose preparation had been extensive and professionally supervised. The completion time that Margaret achieved for the running assessment was remarkable for any candidate regardless of age or athletic background, but it was completely unprecedented for someone of her demographic. More importantly, her performance throughout the assessment showed no decline in technique or pace that would indicate approaching physical limits. Her breathing remained controlled and efficient. Stride mechanics maintained consistency despite accumulated fatigue. Post-exercise evaluation revealed cardiovascular recovery that indicated substantial reserve capacity beyond what the assessment had required. Tommy Peterson, a 25-year-old former college football player, whose confidence in his own abilities had never been questioned, found himself struggling to comprehend how an elderly woman had outperformed him on multiple assessments that should have favored his obvious physical advantages. His preparation for SEAL training had included months of specialized conditioning under professional guidance, yet Margaret's performance consistently exceeded his own results across all measured categories. The psychological impact of being surpassed by someone he had initially dismissed as harmlessly delusional was beginning to affect his confidence and focus. The strength assessment that concluded the day's evaluation represented the final component of preliminary candidate screening. Designed to measure functional capacity for equipment handling and tactical movement requirements that characterized actual SEAL operations. Weightlifting, equipment carrying, and obstacle manipulation were performed under time pressure that simulated operational conditions where physical capability could determine mission success or failure. The standards were absolute and non-negotiable, eliminating candidates whose strength fell below minimum requirements regardless of their performance in other assessment areas. Margaret approached the strength assessment with the same calm confidence that had characterized her previous performances, though this evaluation would provide the clearest test of age-related limitations that typically prevented older individuals from meeting military physical requirements. Equipment weights were substantial and non-adjustable, representing actual loads that SEAL personnel carried during operational deployments. Time requirements were demanding and realistic, reflecting scenarios where strength and endurance determined tactical effectiveness and survival probability. The performance that Margaret delivered during strength assessments exceeded all expectations and established new standards for candidate evaluation at the facility. Equipment lifting was accomplished with technique that minimized injury risk while maximizing efficiency, demonstrating knowledge of biomechanical principles that required professional instruction to master. Load carrying utilized weight distribution methods that prevented fatigue accumulation during extended movement requirements. Obstacle manipulation showed familiarity with leverage applications that reduced strength requirements through intelligent technique application. Chief Master Sergeant Tony Williams had supervised strength assessments for elite military candidates throughout his career, but Margaret's performance represented capabilities that challenged his understanding of human physical potential. Her lifting techniques weren't self-taught methods but reflected instruction from strength coaches who understood competitive weightlifting at advanced levels. Load carrying demonstrated endurance that belonged to candidates whose preparation had included months of specialized conditioning. Most remarkable was her apparent ease with challenges that left other candidates obviously struggling despite their apparent physical advantages. The completion of Margaret's preliminary assessments created unprecedented administrative situation that required immediate attention from base leadership. Her performance across all evaluation categories exceeded minimum standards by substantial margins, qualifying her for advancement to intensive training phases despite obvious age characteristics that should have prevented such success. Equal opportunity regulations required identical treatment regardless of personal characteristics, but no precedent existed for managing publicity and safety concerns that her continued participation might generate. The evening briefing that addressed Margaret's qualification results included input from medical personnel, training instructors and administrative staff who struggled to develop appropriate responses to situations that exceeded all previous experience. Dr. Watson's medical evaluation confirmed that Margaret's physical condition supported safe participation in advanced training activities, though her age remained a concern for liability and insurance purposes. Instructors acknowledged that her demonstrated capabilities exceeded those of many candidates who had been accepted for training without question. Administrative personnel noted that rejection at this stage could create legal challenges based on age discrimination if her qualifications were otherwise acceptable. Commander Morrison found himself facing decisions that could establish precedent affecting military training standards throughout all service branches. Margaret's unexpected success had attracted attention from senior leadership who were monitoring the situation for policy implications and public relations concerns. The decision to allow her advancement to intensive training phases represented calculated risk that could enhance or damage institutional reputation depending on ultimate outcomes and media coverage that might result from her continued participation. The decision to advance Margaret Sullivan to Phase 2 of SEAL candidate evaluation sent ripples of disbelief throughout Naval Amphibious Base Coronado that extended far beyond the immediate training community. Word of her unprecedented success spread through military networks with the speed that only truly extraordinary events could generate, reaching personnel who had never witnessed anything comparable during decades of service in elite military training environments. Senior officers from other commands began requesting briefings on the situation, seeking to understand how an octogenarian had achieved qualification standards that eliminated the majority of candidates who possessed every apparent physical advantage. Captain Michael Rodriguez found himself fielding inquiries from Pentagon officials whose interest in Margaret's progress reflected concerns about policy implications and precedent-setting decisions that could affect military training standards across all service branches. The questions were pointed and specific, focusing on verification procedures that had confirmed her qualification results and legal review of advancement decisions that might create liability issues or discrimination claims. Rodriguez's responses were necessarily cautious, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation while emphasizing that all evaluation protocols had been followed precisely, and that Margaret's advancement was based solely on documented performance that exceeded established standards. The administrative complexity surrounding Margaret's continued participation required coordination with legal specialists who possessed expertise in military personnel regulations and equal opportunity compliance. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Staff Judge Advocate's Office was assigned to review all documentation and procedures related to Margaret's evaluation process, ensuring that advancement decisions could withstand scrutiny from oversight agencies and media organizations that might challenge the legitimacy of her qualification results. Hayes's preliminary review confirmed that all assessment protocols had been properly implemented, and that Margaret's performance metrics exceeded minimum standards by substantial margins. Dr. James Foster, the base's senior physical evaluation specialist, conducted additional medical assessments, specifically designed to verify Margaret's capability for advanced training phases that would present significantly greater physical and psychological challenges. The evaluation protocols were comprehensive and intensive, including cardiovascular stress testing, biomechanical analysis, and psychological screening that explored motivation and mental resilience under extreme pressure. Foster's professional reputation was built on accurate assessment of candidate capabilities, and his evaluation of Margaret would carry substantial weight in determining her suitability for training that had historically produced numerous injuries and occasional fatalities. The results of Foster's extended medical evaluation created additional questions about Margaret's background while confirming her remarkable physical condition and psychological preparation for advanced training challenges. Cardiovascular testing revealed exercise capacity that typically required years of intensive conditioning to develop, with oxygen consumption measurements that belonged to competitive athletes decades younger. Biomechanical analysis showed movement patterns and muscle activation sequences that reflected extensive training in activities that weren't available through civilian fitness programs. Psychological evaluation indicated stress tolerance and mental resilience that suggested previous exposure to high-pressure situations requiring exceptional performance under adverse conditions. Tommy Peterson's reaction to Margaret's advancement represented the psychological impact that her unexpected success was having on other candidates whose confidence had been built on assumptions about their own superiority and natural advantages. His previous dismissal of her capabilities had been replaced by growing uncertainty about his own preparation and qualification prospects, creating performance anxiety that began affecting his training results and competitive focus. The presence of someone who consistently outperformed him despite obvious disadvantages challenged fundamental beliefs about physical capability and competitive advantage that had defined his identity throughout his athletic career. The beginning of Phase 2 training introduced Margaret to instruction protocols that were specifically designed to eliminate candidates whose preliminary success hadn't reflected genuine capability for SEAL operations. Combat swimming requirements included underwater navigation and equipment recovery exercises that demanded technical skills far beyond basic aquatic competence. Land warfare training incorporated weapons handling and tactical movement techniques that required coordination and strength under combat stress conditions. Survival instruction tested resourcefulness and adaptability in hostile environments where physical capability merged with mental toughness to determine success or failure. Margaret's approach to combat swimming instruction demonstrated familiarity with techniques that suggested previous exposure to military or professional dive training far beyond what recreational programs could provide. Her underwater navigation was precise and efficient, utilizing compass headings and distance estimation methods that required extensive practice to master. Equipment recovery exercises were performed with calm competence that indicated experience with underwater work in challenging conditions. Most impressive was her apparent comfort operating in near-zero visibility conditions that triggered panic responses in other candidates whose preparation had been limited to clear water training. Master Chief William Torres, the senior combat swimming instructor, found himself reassessing training methods and candidate evaluation criteria based on Margaret's demonstration of capabilities that exceeded his expectations for any candidate regardless of age or experience level. Her technique was not only proficient but reflected refinements that suggested instruction from military dive specialists whose expertise wasn't available through civilian training programs. The precision of her movements and efficiency of her air consumption indicated understanding of underwater physics and physiology that required advanced education to develop. The weapons training component of Phase 2 presented Margaret with equipment and techniques that were completely unfamiliar to candidates whose background was limited to civilian sporting activities or basic military service. Assault rifles, machine guns, and explosive devices required knowledge of mechanical operation, maintenance procedures, and tactical employment that demanded intensive instruction and extensive practice to achieve competence. Safety protocols were absolute and non-negotiable, with immediate elimination resulting from any violation that might endanger training personnel or compromise operational security. Margaret's performance during weapons instruction created additional evidence that her background included experiences that she hadn't disclosed during preliminary interviews and security screening. Her handling of military firearms was competent and safe, demonstrating familiarity with weapons systems that weren't available for civilian training or recreational shooting. Maintenance procedures were performed with understanding of mechanical principles that required instruction from qualified military armors. Most telling was her apparent comfort with equipment whose operation and tactical employment required knowledge that exceeded what basic military training could provide. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the primary weapons instructor, observed Margaret's training performance with growing curiosity about the experiences that had prepared her for challenges that confused candidates whose preparation had included extensive civilian shooting experience. Her stance and grip techniques reflected military training protocols that weren't taught in civilian programs. Reload procedures were performed with muscle memory that indicated extensive practice under time pressure. Safety consciousness was absolute and automatic, showing internalization of protocols that required professional instruction and supervised practice to develop. The tactical movement training that occupied the afternoon hours of Phase 2 instruction introduced candidates to infiltration and reconnaissance techniques that formed the foundation of SEAL operational capability. Small unit tactics, camouflage and concealment, and communication procedures were practiced in realistic scenarios that simulated enemy contact and mission completion under hostile conditions. Professional activity in non-military occupations. Educational background was properly documented through civilian institutions with no indication of military or specialized training that might explain her demonstrated capabilities. However, Harper's investigation also identified periods during Margaret's early adult years when documentation was sparse and activity records were incomplete, suggesting possible involvement in programs or activities that weren't reflected in standard background check databases. Security clearance applications from decades earlier showed employment with defense contractors whose work involved classified programs, though specific details of her assignments weren't available through normal investigative channels. Travel records indicated international activity that might have involved government service, though confirmation required access to classified personnel files that demanded higher authorization levels. The discovery of Margaret's possible connection to classified defense programs required expansion of the background investigation to include agencies whose records weren't normally accessible through routine security screening. Harper's requests for additional information triggered review processes that involved multiple government organizations whose cooperation would be necessary to verify or contradict Margaret's claimed civilian background. The investigation was becoming complex and time-consuming, though training schedules couldn't be delayed pending resolution of questions that might take weeks or months to answer definitively. Commander Morrison found himself managing increasingly complicated administrative and security issues while maintaining training programs that couldn't accommodate extended delays for individual candidate investigation. Margaret's continued participation required daily decisions about information access and training activities that might compromise classified material if her background investigation revealed security concerns. Conversely, suspension of her training pending investigation completion might create legal challenges if she was ultimately cleared for continued participation and her advancement opportunities had been damaged by unsubstantiated security concerns. The solution that Morrison implemented involved modified training protocols that allowed Margaret's continued participation while limiting her access to the most sensitive information and techniques until background investigation could be completed. Training activities were restructured to emphasize physical conditioning and basic tactical skills while deferring advanced operational techniques that involved classified procedures and equipment. The approach preserved Margaret's advancement opportunities while protecting institutional security interests until her background could be thoroughly verified. Margaret's response to the modified training schedule demonstrated flexibility and understanding that reflected appreciation for legitimate security concerns while maintaining focus on qualification objectives that didn't require access to classified information. Her performance continued to exceed standards across all permitted training categories, further establishing her credibility as a legitimate candidate whose capabilities warranted advancement regardless of administrative complications that surrounded her participation. The psychological evaluation that Dr. Watson conducted with Margaret explored motivation and personal history that might explain her unprecedented decision to attempt SEAL training at advanced age when most individuals were focused on retirement activities and leisure pursuits. Watson's questions were designed to identify mental health concerns or unrealistic expectations that might create safety hazards or training disruption while respecting privacy rights and avoiding discriminatory practices based on age assumptions. Margaret's responses during psychological evaluation revealed thoughtful consideration of training demands and realistic assessment of personal capabilities balanced against program requirements and elimination risks. Her motivation was clearly stated and rationally justified, though she declined to provide detailed information about personal experiences that had prepared her for military training challenges. Watson's professional assessment indicated mental stability and emotional resilience that supported continued participation, though questions about background preparation remained unanswered. The completion of Phase 2 training represented significant milestone in Margaret's progression through SEAL candidate evaluation, with performance results that qualified her for advancement to Phase 3 despite ongoing questions about her background and preparation. Her success had attracted attention from senior military leadership whose interest reflected both admiration for her achievement and concern about precedent and policy implications that her advancement might create for future candidate evaluation procedures. The announcement that Margaret Sullivan had successfully completed Phase 2 training and qualified for advancement to the most intensive phase of SEAL candidate evaluation sent shockwaves through military training communities worldwide, establishing her as either the most remarkable individual in military history or the subject of the most elaborate deception ever attempted against United States Special Forces training programs. Her achievement represented success that had eluded thousands of candidates who possessed every apparent advantage, creating legend that would influence military training standards and age discrimination policies for generations to come. The transition to Phase 3 training marked the beginning of what military personnel universally acknowledged as the most demanding physical and psychological challenge in modern warfare preparation. Hell Week represented 7 days of continuous operation with minimal sleep, maximum physical stress and relentless psychological pressure designed to eliminate candidates whose mental toughness couldn't sustain performance under conditions that simulated the worst possible operational scenarios. Historical elimination rates exceeded 80% during this phase, with candidates who had successfully completed all previous training simply unable to maintain the intensity required for advancement to final qualification phases. Margaret Sullivan entered Hell Week carrying the weight of unprecedented attention from military leadership, media organizations, and government officials whose interest in her progress had transformed what should have been routine training into a closely monitored experiment with implications for policy and precedent throughout the defense establishment. Security protocols had been enhanced to prevent unauthorized access to training areas where Margaret's performance would be observed and documented by personnel whose reports would influence decisions affecting military training standards for decades to come. The opening ceremony that commenced Hell Week took place at dawn on Monday morning, with candidates assembled in formation while instructors explained the requirements and expectations that would govern the next 7 days of continuous evaluation. Sleep would be limited to brief periods totaling less than 4 hours throughout the entire week. Food would be provided at irregular intervals in quantities insufficient to maintain normal energy levels. Physical activities would continue without pause, incorporating swimming, running, obstacle courses and equipment handling under conditions designed to test human endurance beyond normal limitations. Senior Chief Daniels addressed the assembled candidates with the gravity that Hell Week demanded, his words carrying the weight of experience with training that had broken some of the strongest individuals ever to attempt SEAL qualification. The statistics were sobering and clear, with fewer than 20% of candidates successfully completing Hell Week requirements regardless of their previous preparation or demonstrated capabilities. Mental toughness would be tested more severely than physical conditioning, with psychological pressure designed to identify individuals whose commitment to SEAL service exceeded their personal comfort and safety concerns. Margaret's position within the candidate formation drew curious glances from fellow trainees whose awareness of her unprecedented success had created mixture of respect and skepticism about her ability to survive training that challenged men half her age who possessed obvious physical advantages. Tommy Peterson stood nearby, his previous confidence replaced by nervous energy that reflected growing uncertainty about his own prospects for Hell Week completion. The presence of someone whose consistent performance had exceeded his own results created psychological pressure that compounded the stress of facing training that he knew would test every aspect of his preparation and natural capability. The first challenge of Hell Week involved immediate transition from ceremony to full-intensity physical activity without warm-up or preparation time that might allow candidates to mentally adjust to the sudden escalation in demands. Ocean swimming in frigid Pacific waters was conducted in full combat gear with equipment, weights and restrictive clothing that transformed routine aquatic exercise into survival challenge requiring exceptional technique and mental resilience. Water temperature was deliberately maintained at levels that induced hypothermia symptoms within minutes, testing candidates' ability to maintain performance despite physical discomfort that exceeded normal human tolerance. Margaret entered the Pacific Ocean with calm determination that contrasted sharply with the obvious anxiety displayed by other candidates whose preparation hadn't included exposure to conditions that approached Hell Week intensity. Her swimming technique remained efficient and controlled despite equipment loads that challenged even the strongest participants, demonstrating familiarity with gear-laden swimming that suggested previous experience with similar training requirements. Most remarkable was her apparent comfort in water conditions that triggered panic responses in candidates whose civilian swimming background hadn't prepared them for military aquatic challenges. Dr. Foster monitored Margaret's physiological response to cold water immersion with particular attention to age-related factors that might create dangerous health complications during extreme environmental exposure. Body temperature regulation in elderly individuals typically showed reduced efficiency compared to younger candidates, creating potential for rapid hypothermia development that could prove life-threatening. However, Margaret's vital signs remained stable throughout extended cold water exposure, with core temperature maintenance that indicated adaptation mechanisms typically associated with extensive cold weather training and conditioning. The completion of the initial swimming challenge provided no respite for recovery or warming, with immediate transition to land-based physical activities that maintained the relentless pace characteristic of Hell Week training philosophy. Log-carrying exercises required teams of candidates to transport telephone pole-sized timber across sand dunes and rocky terrain while maintaining formation integrity and communication protocols. The physical demands were substantial, but coordination requirements provided additional challenges that tested leadership skills and teamwork capabilities under extreme stress conditions. Margaret's performance during log-carrying exercises demonstrated leadership qualities and team coordination skills that hadn't been apparent during individual assessment phases, revealing capabilities that exceeded what her civilian background should have provided. Her understanding of leverage principles and weight distribution techniques allowed her team to maintain efficiency despite the obvious disadvantage created by her smaller physical stature. More importantly, her calm voice and clear directions provided stability for team members whose stress levels were beginning to affect their performance and decision-making capabilities. Corporal Martinez, assigned to observe and document candidate performance during team exercises, noted Margaret's emergence as natural leader whose influence on team dynamics exceeded what her apparent physical limitations might suggest. Her technical knowledge of efficient carrying techniques wasn't self-taught but reflected instruction from experienced military personnel whose expertise in equipment handling wasn't available through civilian training programs. Most telling was her ability to maintain team morale and focus despite accumulated fatigue and stress that were beginning to affect other candidates' emotional stability. The evening meal that concluded the first day of Hell Week was intentionally inadequate in quantity and nutritional content, providing insufficient calories to support the energy expenditure that candidates had experienced during initial training activities. Food restriction was deliberate and calculated, designed to test mental resilience and physical adaptation under conditions that simulated operational scenarios where adequate nutrition might not be available for an extended period. Hunger would become constant companion throughout Hell Week, compounding stresses while testing candidates' ability to maintain performance despite basic physiological needs remaining unsatisfied. Margaret's response to food restriction demonstrated understanding of nutrition science and hunger management that suggested previous exposure to deprivation conditions requiring specialized knowledge to survive safely. Her consumption patterns were disciplined and strategic, maximizing nutritional benefit from limited quantities while avoiding digestive complications that could impair physical performance. Most impressive was her apparent comfort with hunger levels that created obvious distress in other candidates whose preparation hadn't included exposure to sustained caloric deficit. The sleep schedule that governed Hell Week allowed candidates brief rest periods totaling less than 1 hour during the first 24-hour cycle, with subsequent nights providing even less opportunity for recovery. Sleep deprivation was systematic and progressive, designed to test cognitive function and decision-making capability under conditions that approached the limits of human endurance. Micro-sleep episodes and hallucinations were expected outcomes that instructors monitored to ensure candidate safety while maintaining training intensity that limited individuals whose mental resilience couldn't support operational requirements. Margaret's adaptation to extreme sleep deprivation revealed mental discipline and fatigue management techniques that belonged to individuals whose previous experience had included exposure to conditions requiring sustained alertness despite exhaustion. Her cognitive function remained sharp and focused despite accumulated sleep debt that was affecting other candidates' ability to follow instructions and maintain safety consciousness. Most remarkable was her emotional stability under conditions that reduced some participants to tears and emotional breakdown. Tuesday morning brought escalation in Hell Week intensity with introduction of combat scenario training that combined physical challenges with tactical decision-making under extreme stress conditions. Urban warfare simulations required candidates to navigate hostile environments while carrying wounded team members and maintaining communication with command elements. Physical demands were enormous, but mental challenges of coordinating complex activities while exhausted and stressed provided the primary test of candidates' suitability for SEAL operations. Margaret's performance during combat simulations demonstrated tactical knowledge and battlefield awareness that couldn't be explained by civilian background or recreational military interest. Her movement techniques minimized exposure to simulated enemy fire while maintaining mission effectiveness and team coordination. Medical training is evident in her handling of casualty evacuation procedures that required knowledge of trauma treatment and patient transport techniques. Most telling was her apparent comfort making life and death decisions under pressure that challenged experienced candidates whose preparation had included extensive tactical training. Lieutenant Rodriguez observed Margaret's combat performance with growing amazement at capabilities that exceeded those demonstrated by candidates whose military background included active duty experience with combat units. Her situational awareness was exceptional, showing ability to process multiple threat indicators while maintaining focus on mission objectives and team safety requirements. Decision-making remained clear and effective despite stress levels that were impairing candidates' judgment and tactical effectiveness. The weapons handling requirements that occupied Wednesday training activities introduced candidates to movement and techniques that demanded precision and safety consciousness under conditions of extreme fatigue and stress. Live ammunition exercises with assault rifles and explosives required absolute attention to safety protocols while maintaining mission effectiveness and tactical coordination. Mission planning exercises revealed strategic thinking and tactical knowledge that belonged to individuals whose professional experience had included military operations planning at senior leadership levels. Her understanding of intelligence analysis and threat assessment exceeded what civilian background or recreational military study could provide. Most remarkable was her ability to coordinate complex team activities while maintaining awareness of safety considerations and mission constraints that required extensive operational experience to develop properly. The completion of Hell Week represented achievement that fewer than 20% of SEAL candidates accomplished regardless of their previous preparation or natural advantages. Margaret Sullivan's successful navigation of 7 days of continuous evaluation under conditions designed to test human endurance beyond normal limitations established her as a legitimate warrior whose capabilities exceeded those demonstrated by countless candidates who possessed every apparent physical advantage that she obviously lacked. Sunday morning brought conclusion of Hell Week with formal recognition ceremony acknowledging candidates who had survived training that eliminated the majority of applicants despite their extensive preparation and obvious qualifications. Margaret's position among Hell Week graduates represented historic achievement that would influence military training standards and challenge assumptions about age limitations and human potential for generations to come. Her success had attracted attention from senior defense officials whose interest reflected recognition that her accomplishment transcended individual achievement to become demonstration of institutional capability and training effectiveness. The medical evaluation that followed Hell Week completion confirmed Margaret's remarkable physical condition and psychological resilience despite exposure to conditions that had produced medical evacuations and psychological casualties among younger candidates whose preparation had been professionally supervised. The Dr. Foster's assessment indicated no significant health complications or performance limitations that might prevent advancement to final qualification phases. Though questions about her background preparation continued to puzzle medical personnel whose experience hadn't included evaluation of candidates whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters. Agent Harper's expanded background investigation had produced additional questions about Margaret's history while confirming that her civilian identity was legitimate and properly documented throughout available records. However, gaps in documentation during certain periods suggested possible involvement in classified programs or activities that weren't reflected in standard databases, creating need for higher-level investigation that might require weeks or months to complete. The investigation was approaching classified territory that demanded authorization from agencies whose cooperation couldn't be guaranteed or expedited. Commander Morrison faced increasingly complex decisions about Margaret's continued advancement while background investigation remained incomplete, and her access to classified training information created potential security concerns. Her Hell Week success had established her credibility as a legitimate candidate whose capabilities warranted advancement, but administrative complications surrounding her participation were attracting attention from oversight agencies whose involvement could complicate training operations for extended periods. The solution that emerged involved conditional advancement to final training phases with continued restrictions on access to the most sensitive information and techniques until background verification could be completed through classified channels. Margaret's exceptional performance had earned her the right to continue towards SEAL qualification, but security protocols required careful management of information exposure until her complete history could be thoroughly verified and approved by appropriate authorities. Margaret's response to continued administrative complications demonstrated patience and understanding that reflected appreciation for legitimate security concerns, while maintaining focus on qualification objectives that remained achievable despite bureaucratic obstacles. Her performance throughout Hell Week had established her as warrior whose capabilities exceeded institutional expectations, creating foundation for advancement that couldn't be denied, based on security concerns that might ultimately prove unfounded. The breakthrough that resolved Margaret Sullivan's background investigation came from an unexpected source when Agent Harper's persistent inquiries finally reached classified archives maintained by the Defense Intelligence Agency. Deep within files that required presidential-level clearance to access, Harper discovered documentation that transformed Margaret's mysterious capabilities from puzzling anomaly into remarkable revelation that would reshape understanding of American military history and classified operations conducted during the height of the Cold War. The records revealed that Margaret Sullivan had indeed served her country, though not in any capacity that conventional military databases could acknowledge or verify through standard investigative procedures. From 1962 to 1984, she had been a primary operative in a classified program designated Operation Nightfall, conducting deep cover missions behind enemy lines that required capabilities far beyond what traditional military training could provide. Her expertise in combat swimming, weapons handling, survival techniques, and tactical operations had been developed through instruction that represented the pinnacle of special operations training during an era when American intelligence agencies were pioneering techniques that would later become standard practice for elite military units. Operation Nightfall had been so highly classified that its very existence remained unknown to current military leadership, with documentation sealed under national security provisions that prevented acknowledgement even decades after the program's conclusion. Margaret's service record showed completion of training that exceeded current SEAL qualification requirements, including advanced courses in underwater demolition, Arctic survival, parachute infiltration, and psychological warfare techniques that weren't taught in modern military curricula. Her operational deployments had taken her into hostile territory throughout Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, conducting missions that remained classified at levels requiring special presidential authorization to access. The revelation of Margaret's true background created immediate administrative crisis as military leadership struggled to reconcile her legendary service record with the civilian identity she had maintained for over 4 decades. Commander Morrison found himself briefed on classified operations that exceeded his security clearance level, requiring consultation with Pentagon officials whose expertise in historical special operations could provide guidance for managing a unprecedented situation that challenged institutional understanding of military service and heroic achievement. Dr. Foster's medical files were retroactively classified when Margaret's true identity became known, as her physical capabilities and training results could potentially reveal operational techniques and human performance parameters that remained sensitive for national security reasons. The medical data that had puzzled evaluation specialists throughout her training suddenly made perfect sense when viewed in context of preparation and conditioning that had been designed to create superhuman capabilities for missions that demanded performance beyond normal human limitations. General Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, personally traveled to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado to meet with Margaret and address the extraordinary circumstances that her presence had created for military training protocols and security procedures. Hayes's briefing included classified information about Margaret's service record that explained her remarkable capabilities while raising new questions about appropriate recognition for achievements that couldn't be publicly acknowledged due to ongoing security considerations. The meeting between General Hayes and Margaret took place in a secure conference room that had been cleared of all personnel except those with appropriate security clearances and operational need to know about classified programs that remained sensitive 4 decades after their completion. Hayes's opening words acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the situation while expressing institutional gratitude for service that had never received appropriate recognition due to classification requirements that protected operational security and intelligence methods. Margaret's response to finally having her true background acknowledged was characteristically modest and focused on current objectives rather than past achievements that she had been forbidden to discuss for most of her adult life. Her decision to attempt SEAL training at age 80 had been motivated by desire to demonstrate that age limitations were artificial barriers that prevented recognition of capability and experience rather than realistic assessments of human potential. More importantly, she had sought to honor the memory of fellow operatives whose sacrifices had never been publicly acknowledged due to classification requirements that made their heroism invisible to history. The conversation that followed revealed additional details about Margaret's motivation for undertaking SEAL training that connected her current goals with personal losses that had shaped her determination to challenge institutional assumptions about age and capability. Her husband, Colonel James Sullivan, had been killed during a classified mission in 1983, with his death attributed to equipment failure rather than the enemy action that had actually claimed his life. Margaret's desire to complete SEAL training represented both personal tribute to his memory and professional demonstration that experience and skill deserved recognition regardless of apparent physical limitations. General Hayes found herself facing policy decisions that would establish precedents affecting military training standards and security procedures for decades to come. Margaret's successful completion of SEAL training phases despite her advanced age would challenge fundamental assumptions about human potential and age limitations that govern personnel policies throughout the defense establishment. More importantly, her classified background raised questions about appropriate recognition for achievements that couldn't be publicly acknowledged due to ongoing security considerations. The decision that emerged from consultations between Naval Special Warfare Command and Pentagon leadership involved conditional completion of Margaret's SEAL training with special provisions that acknowledged her unique circumstances while protecting classified information that remained sensitive for national security reasons. Margaret would be allowed to complete final qualification phases under modified protocols that recognized her previous training and operational experience while maintaining security procedures that prevented disclosure of classified techniques in historical operations. The announcement of Margaret's conditional advancement to final SEAL qualification phases created immediate media attention that required careful management to prevent disclosure of classified information while acknowledging her remarkable achievement in terms that could be publicly discussed. Official statements described her as a retired government contractor whose extensive experience with defense programs had provided preparation for military training challenges, though specific details of her background remained classified under national security provisions. Tommy Peterson's reaction to learning about Margaret's classified background through unofficially disclosed information represented the psychological impact that her revelation was having throughout the military training community. His previous dismissal of her capabilities had been replaced by profound respect for achievements that exceeded anything he had imagined possible for any individual regardless of age or experience level. The knowledge that he had been training alongside a legendary operative whose service record remained classified created a mixture of awe and humiliation that would influence his future approach to judging others based on appearance rather than demonstrated capability. The final qualification phase that Margaret entered involved advanced tactical training that incorporated techniques and equipment that weren't available during her original service period, requiring adaptation of historical experience to modern operational requirements. Night vision technology, satellite communication systems, and precision-guided weapons represented advances in military capability that had occurred during her decades of civilian life. Though her fundamental understanding of tactics and strategy provided foundation for rapid mastery of contemporary equipment and procedures, Margaret's performance during modern tactical training demonstrated adaptability and learning capability that challenged assumptions about age-related cognitive decline and technological adaptation. Her integration of historical experience with contemporary techniques created hybrid approaches that exceeded standard training protocols while maintaining effectiveness and safety standards required for operational qualification. Most impressive was her ability to mentor younger candidates whose preparation had been extensive but lacked the practical experience that her classified service had provided. The weapons qualification that represented final requirement for SEAL certification involved proficiency testing with equipment that had evolved significantly since Margaret's active service period. Though her fundamental understanding of ballistics and tactical employment allowed rapid adaptation to modern systems, precision shooting requirements were demanding and absolute, with elimination resulting from any failure to meet standards that demonstrated capability for operational effectiveness under combat conditions. Margaret's weapons qualification results exceeded minimum standards by substantial margins, with accuracy measurements that placed her among the top performers in SEAL training history regardless of age or experience level. Her shooting technique reflected refinements that had been developed through actual combat experience rather than training range practice, demonstrating understanding of practical applications that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction or simulated exercises. Chief Torres observed Margaret's final qualification testing with professional admiration that reflected recognition of capabilities that represented the pinnacle of special operations training and experience. Her performance throughout the entire training progression had consistently exceeded expectations while revealing background that explained remarkable achievements through legitimate military service rather than mysterious preparation that had puzzled instructors and administrators throughout her evaluation process. The graduation ceremony that marked Margaret's successful completion of SEAL training represented historic achievement that would influence military policies and challenge age discrimination assumptions throughout the defense establishment. At 80 years old, she had become the oldest individual ever to complete Navy SEAL qualification, demonstrating that experience and determination could overcome apparent physical limitations when supported by proper preparation and unwavering commitment to excellence. General Hayes personally awarded Margaret her SEAL qualification insignia during ceremony that was attended by senior military leadership whose presence acknowledged the significance of her achievement for institutional understanding of human potential and training effectiveness. The moment represented culmination of journey that had begun with widespread skepticism and dismissal but concluded with universal respect for capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters through legitimate military service and extraordinary personal determination. The speech that Margaret delivered following her qualification ceremony was brief and focused on lessons that her experience could provide for future military training and personnel evaluation procedures. Her words emphasized that age limitations were often artificial barriers that prevented recognition of capability and experience rather than realistic assessments of human potential. More importantly, she stressed that proper training and maintained conditioning could preserve capabilities far beyond what institutional assumptions typically acknowledged as possible. Dr. Watson's final medical evaluation confirmed that Margaret's successful completion of SEAL training had been accomplished without significant health complications or performance limitations despite exposure to conditions that challenged human endurance beyond normal parameters.